Chairman of this session, Honorable Sri Gopiji, eminent poet and critic, and my fellow traveler, eminent Malayalam poet, Sri Ram Mohan GKG, Venkatachalam ji, and Deputy Secretary Sahitya Akademi Radhakrishnan ji, and friends. In this session, we are very few people here. First, I apologize for not being able to speak Malayalam. I am very sorry for that. Malayalam is a great language, and we all have read eminent writers from Malayalam in Hindi or English translation. And I am also sorry that today, in the Pension Memorial premises, I am not using my language either, that is Hindi. I should have. This paper is in English. It is about Hindi literature after independence. It is mainly about poetry. But while talking about poetry, I have also taken care of underlining the major events that shaped the Indian sensibility and also the making of fiction in Hindi. So the paper now. It's a short paper. At the very outset, I must admit that I don't have the credentials to talk about the whole of Hindi literature since independence, covering a span of 75 years and a wide range of genres and tendencies. Besides, Hindi literature, and for that matter, all literature, is a continuum, evolving at its own specific pace and driven by its own internal logic and genetics. A social or political upheaval, like wars or gaining independence, may exert a considerable impact on the making of literary artifacts, but it's never a total rupture with the past. The previous tendencies and practices continue, albeit with some deviations or diversions, while some new and unexpected elements break through and may gradually change the entire course. In Hindi literature, if we talk about poetry, we find that the spirit of the freedom movement that once informed the romantic poetry, in Hindi it's called Chayavadi Kavita, and post-romantic poetry gets even stronger and more pervasive after independence. The urge for absolute freedom gets more pronounced in the Hindi poetry after independence. It first appears in the form of questioning the very nature and character of independence and the republic. This was not the country we had fought for and waited so long for. Partition, communal carnage, bloodbath, and a sense of loss impacted the Hindi poetry and fiction in particular. This is not the true freedom that brings in its wake so much suffering and unequal distribution of wealth and happiness. Again, a great poet has written some highly moving pieces on partition, and the poetry of Nirala of that period, and he is our greatest poet of the 20th century. The poetry of Nirala of that period is full of gloom and darkness. This is how Hindi poetry responded to the birth of a new nation. At the same time, it also celebrated the freedom from the British rule, as does Didkar, Bachchan, and Shimangal Singh Suman and others. Though the Tar Saptak, edited by a Gay, was published a little before the independence, it marked the emergence of some new tendencies in Hindi poetry. Now the individual came into the center and poetry began to explore the interiors of the individual's soul and psyche. It is more or less urbane in nature, sophisticated and self-contained. Also, this poetry shows a more intense engagement with the form and a commitment to experimentation. These poets certainly broke down the conventional forms and rigid metrical patterns and betrayed an inclination towards the Western modernization. Simultaneously, however, the progressive group of poets too were active, and they mostly dealt with the external reality, the life of the poor people, and social contradictions. These poets widened the horizon of poetry. They drew sustenance from the folk traditions and brought the language of poetry closer to the actual speech. Nagarjun, Shamsher, Trilochan, Kedarnath Agrawal are among the major representatives of this movement. This progressive poetry is the poetry of protest and resistance. It offers a critique of the times and, like a sensitive antenna of a radar, keeps recording even the minutest vibrations in the life of the nation. Soon a new trend appeared that may be defined as an offshoot of the earlier Prayogvad or experimentalism initiated by Agay and others. This trend was called Nai Kavita. It is new in the sense that it registers a departure from the progressive and neo-romantic poetry and engaged intensively with the changes taking place in the 50s and 60s in the life of lower and middle class people. Again, while it celebrates the individual and sings of its joys, sorrows, and problems in a fast changing world, it expresses a sort of impatience with the socio political situation. Raghuveer Sahai, Shrikant Verma, Kedarnath Singh are some of the major signatures of the movement. Raghuveer Sahai unravels the ironies and paradoxes of the parliamentary democracy, and Kedarnath Singh depicts the disturbing reality through his agonizing images of rural life. Nai Kavita was followed by A Kavita, a rebellious poetry of the new emergent middle class. With their outrageous images, weird language behavior, and attacks on social, political, and sexual taboos, they created a strong ripples. Out of this rebellious matrix emerged two very powerful voices, Dhumil and Kamal Chaudhary, representing the moment of disillusionment with the ruling dispensation and a sense of despair and loss. At the same time, it is the poetry of vigorous protest. Here we have a poetry making a call for absolute freedom and the realization of the ideals of the freedom movement. The feverish hallucinatory tone of this poetry, it is still a haunting experience. At the juncture of progressive movement and experimentalism, we have a unique poet in Muktibodh, Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh. He is a class in himself, and his poetry represents the point where both the progressive and modernist strains meet together, resulting in an entirely new and unparalleled poetic creation. Muktibodh profusely makes use of myths and fantasy. Here poetry is both a mirror and a lamp, reflecting the external and revealing the innermost depths of the being. Hindi poetry takes a new turn in the 8th decade of the previous century. A fresh batch of poets appears, executing a radical shift both at the level of content and form. This poetry has no nomenclature, no manifestos or aesthetic projects like the previous ones. The poetry of the 80s and thereafter both celebrates and critiques life. It is still a committed poetry, but the ideological skeleton has been properly fleshed out. The poetry of the 80s is preceded by a brief spell of Naxal-inspired poetry, but soon those poets too joined in the group of the 80s, represented by Rajesh Joshi, Uday Prakash, Azadi, Manmohan, Manglesh Tabral, and many others. If we look closely at the Hindi poetry of the past 75 years, we detect at least three salient features. At the Hindi poetry of the past 75 years, we detect at least three salient features. First, it is a celebration of life in all its myriad forms and colors. And at the same time, it is fiercely subversive, anti-establishment, and consistently on the side of the common people. The ideals of the freedom movement continue to inspire it. Second, most of the poets, though writing in Hindi or Khadi Boli, come from different language zones, thus enriching and changing the complexion of diction, architecture, and the very way of its being. Agay comes from Punjabi, Muktibodh from Marathi, Nagarjun from Maithili, Trilochan from Awadhi, and so on. Third, Hindi poetry freed itself from the Western and British influences and instead moved closer to the East European, Latin American, African, and Asian poetry. And finally, it must be added that in the past 2 or 3 decades, we have seen the emergence and growth of a new kind of poetry written by Dalits, women, tribals, and even transgenders. Om Prakash Valmiki, Anamika, Katyayani, Anuj Lugun, and Reshma are some of the most magnificent poets from these sections. Freedom is still the watermark of Hindi poetry and also of the whole of Indian poetry. I have already confessed I am not at all competent to talk about fiction with any conviction. Still, I may briefly outline the dominant trends in the novel writing in the past 8 decades. Premchand's realism and village-centric engagements have, of course, been carried over by the succeeding generations, but in a changed fashion. The line of realism has been broadened and deepened by writers like Bhisham Sahni, Amrit Lal Nagar, Yashpal, Kamleshwar, and Rajendra Yadav, and others. And the village as a backdrop has been greatly refined and enriched by Phanishwanath Renu, Shilal Shukl, Rahimasum Raja, Jagdish Chandra, besides others. Hindi novel entered an entirely new terrain with Jayanendra, Agye, Nirmal Verma, Krishna Sokti, and Vinod Kumar Shukla. Our novelists began excavating the inner world of individuals, dealt with man-woman relations with greater openness and subtlety, experimented with the narrative form, veering at times towards a stream of consciousness technique and magic realism. Novel became a site for probing into the whole of life, questioning prevalent values and discovering new meanings as well as uncertainties of existence. Freedom, to conclude, freedom is still one of the fundamental concerns of the Hindi literature of the past 75 years. As we all know that literature is liberation. Thank you.